I think we're about ready to get started here. I just want to thank everyone for joining us, for inspiring conversations about embracing gender identities. As we begin, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge that Wilfrid Laurier University's campuses are located on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Neutrals peoples. In alignment with Laurier's strategic plan, the Inspiring Conversation series seeks to elevate a range of perspectives and ideas, including those of our Indigenous colleagues. The sharing of knowledge is very powerful and a foundational step toward reconciliation. We are grateful to share the space where we can hear, speak to, and learn from one another. Perhaps you're joining us from another location. In that case, I would encourage you to take a moment to honor the Indigenous people who have lived and worked where you reside historically and presently. Acknowledging them reminds us of our important connection to this land where we live, learn, and work. We recognize, honor, and respect these nations as the traditional stewards of the lands and waters. I'm Stevie Forbes-Roberts. I will be your moderator this morning. I have a Master's of Social Work degree from Laurier and work as a mental health clinician working with 2S LGBTQ families and children. The format for today is that we'll start by asking some questions of our panelists about their research and perspectives on issues related to gender diversity. Then we will open up our conversation to the audience and invite you to submit questions of your own. So feel free to use the Q&A box, and I will pose them to our panelists later. To begin the conversations, I'd like to invite Dr. Percy Lezard and Charlie Davis. So just to introduce Dr. Percy Lezard, they, them, is an assistant professor in Laurier's Indigenous Studies program. Welcome, Percy. They were engaged in an intersectional analysis of indigeneity and gender diversity in the context of gender-based violence. They illustrated the rich history and continued resilience and teachings of Two-Spirit people in Indigenous communities. They also identified the historical and contemporary colonial practices that violently imposed heteronormativity and cisnormativity upon Indigenous communities with implications for gender-based violence. Specifically, Lezard shared findings and recommendations for a reimagined future in the MMIW2G2S LGBTQIA+ National Action Plan, which they co-authored, including calls for inclusion to service providers and implications for violence prevention programs. Welcome, Dr. Lezard. And I'm also going to introduce Charlie. Charlie Davis, he, him, is a PhD candidate in community psychology at Laurier. He is a community-based researcher with a strong commitment to conducting action-oriented research that will promote the health and well-being of transgender communities. Davis' dissertation research examines historical trans activism with an emphasis in examining how trans communities have been impacted by Canadian policies. His other research interests include examining the impacts colonial institutions such as universities and governments have on minoritized communities, as well as the interplay between activism and social change. Thank you so much for both of you for sharing your time with us this morning. Now I'll ask each of our panelists to share a little about themselves and their expertise. Starting with Percy, can you get us started?
What is squeezed in teaching and me, while limlam kill shooting, while limlam Huron Wendat, Anishinaabe Haudenosaunee, while limlam Afro-Indigenous, Black Indigenous relatives and kin, and for allowing me to be invited guest here in the Dish with One Spoon. I spoke in my language, and my Indian name is Percy. My pronouns are they, them, and I'm a Two-Spirit person. I simultaneously get to be Two-Spirit and trans, because I don't want to conflate the two. A little bit about me. In an era across the academic industrial complex of fraudsters, I am a registered member under the Indian Act to the Penticton Indian Band, and under our nation's custom code, I am claimed. I have a people, I have a language, I have a culture. And part of my responsibility here as an invited guest in the Dish with One Spoon is upholding treaty and pushing back against anti-Blackness, ableism, and ageism. Everything I do is directed and supported in community, to the land, and to my relationships to the people who who have invited me into spaces. And when, other than that, I get a paycheck here at Wilfrid Laurier. And yeah, with that, I bring 38 years of helping, otherwise known as a social worker, which I feel is a colonial project based on its origin stories. But prior to that, Indigenous folks had wide variety of ways of helping. And that's my PhD dissertation, Abolition of Social Work. Again, that's a little bit about me, and I'll turn it over back to Stevie. Limlump folks.
And I'm going to turn it back to Percy sorry, Percy, you just introduced yourself. I'm going to turn it over to Charlie.
Thank you, Stevie. And thank you for inviting me here to be part of this conversation. I'm very excited. As Stevie mentioned, my name is Charlie Davis, and I'm a doctoral student at community psychology at Waterloo Region University. And to kind of explain what some of my research is, I have to explain what community psychology is because sometimes people don't know. So community psychology is a branch from clinical psychology, but we are more focused at looking at how individual wellness or community level wellness is impacted by more structural or systemic factors. So I guess community psychologists look at creating interventions or programs that incorporate what we call transformative change. So change that we see as being long-lasting, sustainable, that actually gets at addressing some of those root factors of oppression, rather than what we call ameliorative changes, or like what can be considered a Band-Aid solution. And so when we talk about transformative change, oftentimes we see, changing public policy or getting changes within policy to be kind of like the pinnacle or synonymous with transformative change. But with my research, what I wanted to do was to really interrogate whether or not that is actually true. So for my doctoral research, I wanted to do something that would kind of help support a lot of the trans activism that I do. So I've been a queer activist for 16 years, which is about half my life now. And I wanted to look at, some of the root causes of trans systemic oppression in Canada. We don't actually have a lot of history about how trans or queer rights have evolved in Canada. We kind of have this assumption that things have evolved the same way as the US, but I wanted to really look at whether or not that was the case. And so a lot of my research is specifically looking at what are the actual structural or systemic oppression that's impacting people today, and how was that caused by policy that was implemented in like the 70s and 80s that we have lost the institutional knowledge of, and how can we actually address some of the core issues to improve the well-being for trans people. So we can get into some of those more, minute things and some of the other questions, I'm sure, but I will leave it there for now. And I'll turn it back over to Stevie.
Thank you so much, Charlie. So let's dive into our topic for today, which is embracing diversity. We have gender diversity specifically. We have some questions for discussion, and I invite each of you to chime in with your perspective. So I'll ask both of you, when you both do research specifically examining health and social service access for Indigenous and to LGBTQIA+ communities, what are some of the common barriers they face? Big question for both of you to start us off.
I think as an Indigenous person, I don't come to this work from a place of joy or thriving. I come to this place as a person with intersecting identities, because I mentioned in my introductions that I also get to be two-spirit and trans. Often those two things get conflated. And people only want to see a certain aspect of indigeneity, and that's the performance of indigeneity, but they don't actually look at the systemic and structural issues that impact the communities both historically and in contemporary times. and actually erase from the narrative and conversation that Indigenous, gender diverse folks existed prior to contact. And despite ongoing colonialism, we still are here, right? The thing that I want to pose is, yeah, so some of the common barriers, well, I have to be exceptional as a scholar and thinker to be deemed as someone who has something notable of saying. I'm a shirk reviewer. Anything that has to do with 2S LGBTQI submissions, I look at. I'm a CIHR reviewer. I did so for our institution. But yet the applications that I've seen have not reflected the community, meaning cis folks, white folks, able-bodied folks, older folks, our non-Black folks are applying and researching. And I know the critique always has been from Black and Indigenous, Afro-Indigenous, because my definition of indigeneity includes those communities, is that we've been researched to death. And there's a the history of the ways in which that has happened to us. So some of the common barriers: access to information, access to who gets the grants, who gets to build their careers off of Black Indigenous death, and who gets to be seen as an expert without actually having lived experiences, or being able to nuance the ways in which whiteness operates and white supremacy in the context of Indigenous, trans folks, gender diverse folks. So those are some of the barriers in terms of knowledge gathering, because in order to have conversations about knowledge dissemination, you need to look at who's, where do people get the money from, how are they assessed, and who gets awarded, and who gets to benefit from getting access to large grants over 3 to 5 years, and who gets to keynote at peer-reviewed conferences and gets book deals without actually having lived experience. So yeah, so those are some of the barriers that I want to nuance and bring to the conversation. Yeah.
That's great, thank you. So this kind of ties into a lot of what you just said, but are there things that settlers should understand about the experience of being a two-spirit or gender fluid Indigenous person?
Well, there's been report after report written by Indigenous folks. We're in the era of shock and awe that people have gone through the whole career, whether in grade school or their college degree or their undergrad or their master's or their doctorate, to go, oh my gosh, I didn't believe this would happen. But yet we've had the Royal Commission on Aboriginal People since the 90s. We've had the Truth and Reconciliation since 2015, the tens of thousands of pages, and now we've had the National Inquiry and the specific work that I was generously invited to do with this document that talks about the ways in which 2S LGBTQIA folks experience ongoing colonialism and the ways in which we're reacting. I look forward to the day in which my intersecting identities and my family, my communities, and my nations get to respond rather than react, and actually get to experience 2S LGBTQIA joy, and we get to thrive, and we get to have nice things. And I think the conversation needs to move from what can we do? There have been hundreds of calls to action and documents on what folks can do. And I get that people get overwhelmed. Well, try living these day-to-day existences as Black, Indigenous, Afro-Indigenous, Indigenous people of ongoing colonialism. So take one of those things from each one of those documents and make it your life's work, professionally, personally, and socially. Be in conversation with others and really unpack, well, I didn't do that. Well, everybody here gets to benefit from the dispossession, disappearance, and erasure of Indigenous, Black, Indigenous, 2S LGBTQIA folks. So start from there. Read it. Read all those documents, and if anything, read this document. It's accessible online. And encourage 3 others and be in conversation about the ways in which you can help eliminate the experiences of ongoing genocide and colonialism that Indigenous, Afro-Indigenous people experience.
Fabulous, thank you. Do your research. Learn what you don't know, because the colonizers and colonization has hidden it from you. I'm going to actually ask the same question of Charlie. So What is something that you, Charlie, think that settlers should understand about the experience of being a two-spirit or gender fluid Indigenous person?
I feel like I have no right to say to respond to this question. So I would politely ask if I could answer the first question, because I don't think there's anything I can add based on what Percy has said.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's fair enough, right? Like putting the spotlight on what Percy has shared. Yeah. Can I ask you then, in your time as a graduate student, what has your experience been like navigating the education system as a transgender man?
Yeah, and so I feel depends on what degree I was in. And so what I have noticed in, looking at social change is that usually there's a period where something, I want to say something is introduced, but it's like, the colonizers like learn that people outside of them actually exist. And then there's like this novelty that's associated with them. And then, we see this backlash that's happening. And so when I entered my master's in 2013, I was the first out trans student that my professors had worked with. And so there was this element of like, oh, like we need to figure out how to do these things. And like, so I didn't experience a lot of overt transphobia, I want to say. So it was very subtle, like, some of the people who spoke multiple languages, when I would say my pronouns, they would be like, oh, I am so cultured, like I can speak 7 languages. So I understand that pronouns don't even exist in other languages. And you're like, okay, that's a weird comment, but thank you. But when I entered my PhD back in 2016, the culture had very much changed. And so this is when, the incident was happening at Laurier, which, I'm not going to name, but the president of Laurier was very vocal in siding in with freedom of speech over the rights of trans students. And there was, active mobilization of completely defunding any student service that had to do with queer students or pro-rights. And so this was, when I started to experience like some of the most administrative harm that I've ever experienced as an out trans person. And so it's interesting to me that, my grad trajectory started with, people being like, okay, well, I don't like, you're trans, I got that. I'm gonna, mess up, but like, we're trying, like, just work with me, we're trying. And then, only, I think it was 4 years later, it was a complete shift. And there was the most transphobia I've ever experienced in a place. And to me, it was not wild that it happened in under 5 years, but it was, I feel a sign of how things can shift quite dramatically. And I think, we can say for all institutions, there's always pockets where you will feel safe. And there was, a difference between like the context of what an institution is like at the broader scale. And so I would say that like in my pockets, there wasn't any difference in how I was treated or, in my feelings of safety. But then it was like, if I had to interact with, administrators or, different levels of bureaucracy, I would have to get my back up to be like, wow, they made it very clear that they don't want to support trans rights and they would rather support, freedom of speech or whatever that means. And so definitely pockets and very, very radical social change and how things have shifted in the past couple of years.
Great, thank you for sharing that. Really tough time and continues to be a tough time. I'm going to circle you back just to the idea around barriers in research, specifically for Indigenous and to us LGBTQ folks. What barriers do you see are most common?
Yeah, and so I think this kind of goes back to what Percy was saying about, the impacts of colonization. Like colonization has impacted every single facet of our society. It has impacted how we create our systems. It's impacted how we create our institutions. And so one of the things that I would say is that like our institutions, how they are created are not designed for everyone, right? Like academia is not designed for everyone. Healthcare is not designed for everyone. And so in some of the advocacy that I've done, well, I have worked directly with, doctors, nurses to be like, okay, we can give you all of the resources that you need to get, to get your peers on board. Like, what do you need? And they have blatantly said, like, this is generally paraphrasing, so don't quote me on this, but they have said things like, the healthcare system is only really designed to address 80% of needs. So if it becomes an issue of like 600 patients with heart disease or 2 trans patients, like they have to go to, you know, the patients with heart disease just because there's more of them. And I think this kind of gets at to like, okay, so how do we make sure that those 2 trans patients are seen as, you know, as valid or as justified as the 600 patients with heart disease? But my, you know, concern is like, we have accepted that the healthcare system cannot meet 100% of needs. And we have just accepted that as default, right? And like, that is part of how colonization has, you know, changed our systems. Like, we are completely fine with just writing off 20% of the population at every stage, because that's just how we've always done, right? And so like that 20% usually, you know, is, you know, people who are trans, people who are racialized, definitely disabled people. And a lot of, you know, activism is like trying to bring those people into the 80%. But what we really need to do is completely change the systems. And so, you know, a lot of the barriers, like what that actually means is, you know, trans people can't access any space where we have to fill out our gender on an administrative form. And so think of how many intake forms require us to list our gender. That's just how many places that we can't actually access. And then once we do, like, there's no guarantee that we can actually get our needs met, because there's no mechanism in place in Canada to make sure that doctors actually treat their patients, because we've already agreed that like 20% of people will be written off. And so that, I would say, is kind of like the common barrier. The common barrier is that these systems are not designed to address us or to accommodate us. And we've all kind of just accepted that that is just how things are in Canada.
Great. So based on that idea of research and lived experience, what's an example, either of you can answer, or if Percy, you want to respond to what Charlie just said, what is an example of policy you would advocate for to promote gender inclusivity? So we know the problem. It's been very well researched, as everyone has said, by mostly white cis folks. But where do we go from here?
And I think the work that has been done, again, the erasure of Black, Indigenous, racialized trans folks, we don't get to exist. When we hear trans, it's whiteness and white folk, non-BIPOC folks who get to be trans and get a platform and get to be able to be in conversation about their experiences without ever actually nuancing the ways in which Black, Indigenous, or Indigenous folks get weighted to death. Simply for being Indigenous, without even looking at their intersecting identities. We don't even get to have access to healthcare. There is a national epidemic that impacts Indigenous folks, Black folks, for being weighted to death. And if people don't know what that means, you can Google it, right? Basically means that their bodies, once they end up in medical facilities, whether they be hospitals, walk-in clinics, they're not seen as experiencing pain, but they're asked to leave because they're associated with coping. And when I say coping, engaging in substance use or misuse, and when they're actually in a medical distress and they actually are told to leave. And in the course of leaving, content warning, trigger warning for Black, Indigenous, Afro-Indigenous folks in the audience, they later die either by side of the road, like one of my older siblings, or at home, like other members of my family, and members of family nationally that have happened, without actually ever even considering what it means to be gender diverse and engage in the medical model system of, so that's a barrier, absolutely. Often folks, and I know Smiley has documented the experiences of anti-Indigenous racism. I know Dr. Sian Wilson and PhD candidate Anne-Marie Beals has documented the experiences of anti-Blackness in the medical model system. So there's been lots of information that talks about the ways in which our current systems, again, are for the haves and have-nots, two-tier systems, and we are never granted entryway into any of those streams as racialized and gender diverse folks with intersecting identities. So again, these systems were not meant to work. They were not meant to support the holistic wellness of racialized folks who are Black, Indigenous, racialized people of color, or with intersecting identities, gender identity, ability, and age, and geographical location. Yes, I'm currently in a hub that has the standard practice of people, I can be in conversation, or my partner can be in conversation with the people doing intake to say, this is Percy, they use they, them pronouns. If it was not in the hub of one of the hubs across the city, it's often meant with violence. And usually security is called on my Indigenous body, which has happened when I was in a non-hub city, meaning Vancouver, Edmonton, Winnipeg, Toronto, Ottawa. So yeah, again, the ways in which colonialism impacts and affects access to medical care. In terms of policy, I think if I want to go back to policy, the policy that created the binaries and ongoing colonial language and disappearance and erasure of indigeneity and Indigenous folks is the Indian Act. What does the Indian Act have to do with people? Well, it told First Nations folks nationally who we can be and what we could do to be Indigenous. So I think that was I would want to challenge that policy, because that actually introduced heteronormativity, in particular patriarchy, and introduced male and female, and then was upheld to the 126-year epidemic of the Indian residential school, where it totally erased and disappeared the experiences of Indigenous to us LGBTQI folks. So moving, well, what can I do? Well, you can read up and find out what actually happened to Indigenous folks and be in conversation with other people.
Thank you so much for making those links, because I think it's incredibly important that we understand that it's all, like, transphobia, homophobia is all linked in with colonization. Yeah, thank you. So what about you, Charlie? Do you, based on your research and lived experience, what example do you feel like to promote gender inclusivity via policy?
Yeah, and so this is a question I get asked a lot when people find out that I do policy work. And it's a really hard question to answer for all the reasons that Percy just gave, right? Like, and to me, the question I always ask is, like, what are you actually trying to change, or what are you actually trying to do? And so I think that is something that we don't interrogate a lot. And when we create new policy, like, oh, we need a policy on gender inclusivity, or we need a policy to do this. But then it's like, okay, well, how are you going to implement this new inclusive policy in an environment that is very hostile and doesn't care about us to begin with, right? So, like, what are the additional resources you're going to provide for, training or like accommodation, or to like even make sure people even understand the problem in the same way? And so I would kind of say, take a step back, and it's like, if you need a policy to tell people to treat others with respect, a policy is not going to help you, right? Like, you need to change the attitudes and behaviors, and very rarely does that actually happen with a policy, unless it's created by like an agency that has power over you, right? So if you're trying to say, like, my workplace is not great, like, I want to implement a policy, your managers and supervisors have every right to, I shouldn't say every right, your managers and supervisors can ignore that policy whenever they want. And so, like, it's usually, if it's something mandated by, the government, it's like, you must do this, is when we start to see some of those changes. But to kind of go back to, for gender inclusivity, so many things of what Percy said, like, educate yourself on what some of the common issues are, like what even some of this generic language is, and think about, like, what does that mean for when I interact with people, right? So, like, healthcare providers would have to interpret some of these concerns very differently than someone who works at a retail store would. And so, yeah, like, every time I get asked about policy, it's like, well, think back to what you're actually trying to change, because if it's attitudes and like general behavior, it's not really going to happen with a policy. But maybe changing, like, trying to bring in people to do more like education, or like taking on some of that burden to get people to a place where implementing a policy would actually mean something. And sometimes people can't do that when they're within the system. Sometimes you have to bring people out. But it's definitely more than just trying to change one policy, because as Percy mentioned, like, these are like colonial institutions that we're working against. Like changing one policy is not going to change the Healthcare Act. It's not going to change the Indian Act, right? So more policy very rarely helps us and usually can just us in the long run. So it's more so about changing attitudes.
Thank you. And systems. So just bringing everyone's attention to a comment by Percy in the chat there about death-making systems are doing exactly what they're designed to do. Whiteness is doing the exact same thing, erasing Indigenousness. So I think we're good to move to questions, unless the two of you had wanted to continue that discussion. Does that feel like a good time to move to the chat questions? Are you okay with that, Percy? Okay, great. So we do have a question about pronouns. So we have a cisgender, gender-conforming female who is in the chat. They are asking about using she, they pronouns. My intention is to continue to help normalize singular they in contexts where it might not be as common, but I do not want to inappropriately adopt a pronoun. This person has tried to do their own research, but would appreciate hearing perspectives from our panelists.
Only you know who you are, right? Do I feel conversations can happen to disrupt the ways in which people continue to create spaces that are not safe? I also just want to say again, it's not ethical for me to say that I can create a safe space in this webinar. I can't, systemically and structurally. I've shared so many reasons why. What I can do is create the conditions for us to be brave, for you to be who you are, and that can change, and that's okay. I believe many folks can contribute to braver spaces, whether it's in classrooms, whether it's in research, whether it's in community spaces, to do some heavy lifting and support conversations about the beauty and the diversity of gender. And it's changing. Because of who you were yesterday doesn't mean you'll be a different person tomorrow. And I think that's what young folks have been contributing to this movement of wanting to break the gender binary. So yeah, I believe it could only benefit and support ongoing conversations, and not just the normal be, he, him, or binary designations for folks.
Yeah, I agree with everything Percy said. As usual when Percy speaks, the only thing that I would like kind of give a qualifier for is when people adopt pronouns that are associated with different cultures. So if you are a white settler, then obviously she, him, they is within our language, it's within our culture. But like a white settler cannot adopt a two-spirit identity, cannot adopt any of the other identities are associated with different cultures, and so that's the only qualifier I want to say.
Yeah, I'd love to jump in there too, because I think for this person, you should live authentically as you are, and if that pronoun doesn't speak to you, I would say not as an allyship response, but as a response to people being who they are. I think there's other ways you can normalize the they them pronouns by responding, using them well for other people, correcting other people when it's appropriate. That's what I would just kind of add on, in my opinion, but I agree, you be you. So we have another question. What are some ways in which the centering of whiteness within transness in terms of voice, experience, and validity is being challenged? Another big question from the audience. So thank you for that.
So I can kind of speak to this as a white person. So if I'm understanding the question is, what are some of the ways in which the centering of whiteness within trans spaces is being challenged? I think just in how we even define gender. And so I do kind of want to be clear that in a lot of the spaces I operate, it's a very white trans mass space. And so I want to say that with full qualifier. But in a lot of the advocacy that we do, like we want to make sure that the ways in which we are, you know, talking about gender and being trans is not just within white definitions. And so a lot of this specifically means the prioritization of transition, specifically referring to hormones and surgeries. I want to not to say that only white trans people like those type of procedures or need those type of procedures, but the ways in which, you know, gender has been colonized in North America kind of led to this very like binary understanding of gender. And so there was this pressure for trans people to transition if you were trans. So I almost said to become a transsexual. So it's just, I've been reading a lot of medical texts from like the 1960s and 70s. So sometimes that language is in my head. And so I think that prioritization is being challenged, and looking at people who have more gender fluidity, who, you know, don't ascribe to the binary, and who changed who change what the representation of gender is. So people who have transitioned medically, who have a gender fluidity, who then want to have different procedures to, you know, so people who have top surgery, who then want to get breast augmentation later to represent their gender fluidity. And so looking at, you know, how all of the different ways that gender can be considered, we kind of look at, and not trying to prioritize this heavily medicalized understanding as gender and transition only being like a one unilateral, like must go through these milestones within these stages, within this very medically procedural space. At least that's how, as I again want to clarify, that's how a lot of white trans people who are trying to be allies kind of want to push back and say that there are other ways in which we experience gender, or gender is experienced. And so we can't just center our own understandings and our own needs in these spaces.
Yeah, and definitely like that history of trans folks having to conform to that medical narrative of like, I was born in the wrong body and now I'm transitioning to the correct binary, is also part of a colonial medical system. Yeah. Did you want to speak to that as well, Percy?
One thing that I've found very interesting is I was a board member, president, and really of CPATH, which people can Google, and in opposition to WPATH's new forms on medical affirming care for families and children. Found that in conversation with non-BIPOC folks, they always talked about the date in which they transitioned, right? That really, for me, as an Indigenous person, I don't get to have access to medical transitioning, A, because of cost, B, because of being multiple family members being weighted to death. And I know my family and my chosen family and my partner would not allow any of those similar types of occurrences to happen, of anti-Indigenous racism and colonialism and genocide. But why would I want to engage in a system that continues to cause harm and that doesn't even see me as with humanity? I think, where was I going with this? Yeah, so I just found it very fascinating that non-BIPOC folks would always talk about May 2017 as a trans person. I'm like, 1491 as an Indigenous gender diverse person, right? I always think of that. And then always being in spaces that, am I trans enough because I don't go through gender affirming care? But yet the ways in which gender affirming care happen lack the capacity to discuss the ways in which colonialism continues to be operationalized in those systems of miscare, like these death-making systems like the brand has so generously gifted the world. So that's the only comment I found it fascinating that non-BIPOC folks would always have a date for affirming care.
It says a lot about the inequity, right, in the system and how the system is designed to exclude. Yeah, thank you. So this is a question from the audience, do folks see a positive change coming with a new generation of students coming into our spaces? Or is there a problem with bandwagon mentality when it comes to those very real topics that affect people every day?
I don't think I understand what bandwagon means. So if someone can...
I want to quickly say that that is a comment that can be seen as anti-Indigenous racism, because the cavalry and the militarization against Indigenous communities by the cavalry. That's that I would ask you to find another term.
Can we reframe that?
Yeah, reframe it.
Reframe it. So, I don't. They're all problematic when you think about it. This idea of people going with what the populism, right? It's that idea that people are not genuinely wanting to be allies, and that there's some political power in faking it. And I don't know. I would say that makes you not an ally. So, what do folks think about the possibility of new students coming into the spaces and how that might change things? I think we've talked a lot about systems, so I would come back to the idea that without radically changing the university system and who is being invited into these spaces, as we started out there, we're talking about research, there still is a lot of work to do. I don't know if
there definitely needs to be a lot of work to be done, because if I, for example, use myself as an example, my academic journey, I didn't see anybody who reflected my intersecting identities as an Indigenous person until the winter of my undergrad. And I spent 3 years in the institution taking up to 20 courses. I saw my last class for my master's of social work, someone who was queer, but I've never seen someone who was gender diverse. Now, they could have been gender diverse, but because of the ways in which the academic industrial complex is transphobic and the hatred towards trans people, someone could have been trans, but they did not disclose. That's why I front load, and everything about me is gender diverse, because I think I am a cog in this big machine. I have no belief that I'm going to change the system, because I've been in the academic industrial complex for over 20 years and haven't been able to be in an institution that actually honored and celebrated all of my intersecting identities. I check off a lot of boxes. I'm Indigenous, I'm Two-Spirit, I'm trans, I'm disabled, right? And I'm hard, right? So I check off a lot of boxes, and I think that's and I'm asked to be complicit in the sense that this is the particular approach I'm asked to push forward, but that approach has not been working. It contributes to push out of Black, Indigenous, Afro-Indigenous folks and folks with intersecting identities. That if you're not able to comply with this type of learning and pay your tuition, then we don't want you here. Right. So one thing that I want to do is I want to create the opportunities for folks to see themselves reflected, not only for me, because I'm down to the last 11 days as the chair of the Indigenous Studies program, and I can count on one hand how many other Indigenous, Two-Spirit, trans, disabled people hold a tenure track position in college or university nationally. There's 3 of us. Right. So I think again, the academic industrial complex does not want to support diversity. Yes, it has an office of EDI, but it actually steps away from human rights and the liberation for Black folks and sovereignty for Indigenous folks, or thriving of 2S LGBTQI folks, or an accessible space for folks with disabilities, or even letting people know who are young that this is a space for them, where their multiple ways of knowing and being will be honored and celebrated. Right. So yeah, it's not the answer, it's an answer. And I don't reflect all Indigenous people. I don't, my views are not meant to represent all the experiences of Two-Spirit people or trans people or disabled people. It's a response.
Yeah, and I want to jump on to something that Percy said, because when Percy said that, like, going through, academia and never seeing a prof that was like them, I had a very similar experience. Like, I think Percy might be the first trans prof that I met at Laurier, and we're not on the same campus, and so I've never been mentored by a trans person in an academic space, and so I've always tried to, I would always, so I'm trying to think of a polite way to say this, and I think I might just cancel my next sentence. But working with people who didn't have my lived experience and who I had to constantly fight in order to get research done in the way that I wanted, and kind of saying, like, this is the research I can do that doesn't harm my community, and this is the way it has to be done, and how much that was a struggle. So I have nothing but, like, optimism for the next generation, because I think that they, or younger folks, I should say, because just seeing how people even interact with some of these, like, really colonial, like, professionalizations within, like, retail jobs, and they're just like, no, I don't like it, I'm bouncing, I'll just find the next one. Like, that mentality, sometimes gives me hopes that, like, the idea of, like, I don't like this colonial institution, like, academia is colonial, it's harmful, I just won't participate in it, and I'll just do something else. And so I think that we'll definitely see a culture shift. I think it's going to get much worse before, the younger generation takes over and we see some positive changes. But I have optimism when I interact with, like, people who are now teenagers. I'm like, oh yes, you're going to do much better things than I can do in my lifetime. And I'm very excited for it.
I think I just want to add to that. Somebody before I get to be here at the generosity and death, blood, sweat, and tears of folks who came before me. Someone else said it much more eloquent, with sustainability, and with a radical ethical care, which Christina Sharp also has generously gifted us with. And so I did not come to this by myself. I was not born knowing that these are the words that must be said. These are the ways in which I need to engage. It's at the folks who came before me, Christos, Beth Brandt, Myra Laramie, Connie Fife, Sandy O'Sullivan, Andy Farrell, my relatives in the South Pacific, right? So it's at and three-quarters of those folks are not in the academy, right? Just because we're in an academy doesn't mean there's actually more sustainable conversations happening, right? Just because it's here, it's giving validity. Again, multiple ways of knowing and being and thinking are actually flourishing on the land and community. So yeah.
I think there's like a bubble of academia, right? And it's an impermeable bubble. Like, there's influence happening from the outside as well. So both of you conduct community-based research, which prioritizes the voices and partnerships of communities in all stages of the research process. Why is this approach essential for your work? I know Charlie mentioned the, like, fighting to not do harm to communities in his research. How would both of you respond to that, the idea of community-based research and prioritizing the voices?
Yeah, and I think this kind of goes back to what Percy said of, like, there are certain communities that have been researched to death, and the research has not benefited those communities, right? Like, there is about 5 decades worth of research saying that trans people have high rates of suicide. How has that research ever benefited us? And the ways in which I see trans people, and some other, marginalized people who get added to research studies. I see this happen a lot in the HIV field, where they exclusively want to only include cis men, so men who have sex with men. And then, over the years, they'll include more trans people. And it's under the guise of being progressive and be like, oh yes, trans people are part of the queer community, we'll include them. But it's because our data is worse. Right, so, like, if you include trans people, you will have statistical significance in some of these findings because we have worse health outcomes, and so then it's used to promote different programs that then go to benefit cis men who have sex with men, and so I think it's really important to have people's voices in community-based research, but community-based research needs to have a purpose. It needs to be action-oriented. I have no interest in doing research just for the sake of research, right? So, and for my research, one of the things that I had to struggle with is that my brand of community-based research meant not overburdening the community, which meant not doing interviews. And so for other people, it seemed like I was not including voices in my research process and was not acting within a community-based research, but it was because I, in the Kitchener-Waterloo area, for those who don't know, there are 2 huge universities. We also have a different social work campus. Like the trans community gets over-researched all the time, right? For every grad student who does research on queer and trans issues, and they hit the same people, right? And so it's like, in order to do my research in my community and to benefit my community, which is what I want to do, I can't compete with some of the other research happening. And so I did not do interviews. So I don't have participants. And that was done very intentionally to make sure that I looked at, archival research, because trans people have been vocal for decades about these experiences. And now that I have access to all of these archives and databases, it was my job to do the research and to do the work, and to to look at what has already been out there, what people have already been saying, oral history projects, what have our communities been talking about for decades, and then use that as a foundational piece. So don't start with interviews sometimes. So don't, drag community through every step of the process when they don't want to, because that's not doing good community-based research, at least in my mind.
So I just want to clarify. When I talk about 3 people, there are a lot of professors who are gender diverse and Black, Indigenous, Afro-Indigenous, Indigenous, who are in tenure track. But what I want to talk about is a director or chair. My term comes to end July 30th, so I no longer have to carry that responsibility. But in terms of community-based research, I think for the first time, whoever wrote the first paper and have claims to community-based research, I think ownership, control, access, and possession has adjusted the ways in which power, right? Because we're talking about power, folks, within these systems and structures, has shifted in terms of it's shared and directed for and by Indigenous people. This document, the topic is not something that, woo, let's jump out of bed and let's have a lovely conversation about this. Who wants to talk about gender-based violence? Who wants to, right? It's not going to get a bank. That's another conversation. And right? Again, my critique of corporatization of Pride, because we're in Pride Week, it's not going to get a lot of funds or walks or bicycles, this or that, gender-based violence, right? Because the onus is placed on the individual. Just leave. Well, that's not an option, because if we look at the systems and structures, where can I go as a two-spirit trans masked person for housing? Shelter with my family, right? So there are not a lot of options, right? Or people who are doing intake to be able to support me and my newborn child to go into a space should I be experiencing gender-based violence. And this work was literally a for us, by us. Without us, right? Without us, it doesn't happen. And shifting the power to actually not be on the person doing the research, but actually being directed by the people experiencing under the conditions of colonialism, a conversation forward, and how that conversation forward gets documented and cited and written and shared. I think is huge, because academics would go and just go extract, resource extraction. Okay, not really care for the community, but now researchers have a responsibility to care for folks. How are you spiritually providing for folks? What does it say about you if you don't have a relationship with elders, right? To come in and open in a particular good way and people to have access. How are you feeding people? How are you ensuring that there's enough food for them to take away? How are you ensuring that you're doing more than just compensating people for a voucher? How are you creating space for them to get there and get away, get back home? And how are you supporting them that if they should have people that they care for, right? And that's the type of work I'm invited to do. It's not brand. It's the things that have been directed to me by community young folks, because in my protocol, and this may shatter people's, young folks are elders, the knowledge keepers, right? And you know what I mean? And knowing that each community where you are situated, whether rural or an urban setting, is on top of an Indigenous homelands, and they have protocol. So it's your responsibility to figure that out. That's not to come running to Percy and say, what do I do here? No, you need to be in conversation with other non-BIPOC people about what are some of the protocol. How do you find those things out? Search Toronto. There are other chapters. Great ways to be in conversation with other white folks, right? To figure out what are some reasonable ways that I can reduce the harm by me interacting with this community. Right? And be a good relative. I see that people. I'm not interested in allies, because allies are like a badge. Right? You get to wear it and say, this makes me a good person. This means I'm benevolent, means other people are bad and I'm not. Well, name the ways in which you're complicit. Name the ways in which you continue to benefit off the erasure and disappearance of Black, Indigenous, 2S LGBTQI folks. Let's start from there, right? And then move through your fragility and shock and awe, and then be open to hearing direction. Because we've given many, like I said, all those documents I said before, you can rewind and look at the captions and, okay, I'll do it again. Royal Commission on Aboriginal People, the TRC 94 calls to action, the tens of thousands of pages that 6,000 survivors have shared, the National Inquiry, and my document, the document that I was gifted and invited to do. And with the upcoming work that's coming out of folks who were stolen through the 60 scoop, right? Policies have done nothing but continue to harm Indigenous people. Well, Percy, if we don't have policies, we don't have a structure. Well, you don't have a settler structure, right? Underneath these cities in concrete are protocol and governance systems that people have had and ways of governing and interacting. So know those things. Again, the ways in which I'm invited in, if you have the capacity to show a consistency of behavior over an extended period of time, I'm looking for accomplices. And much like many Indigenous folks, what are the ways in which you're going to actualize becoming a verb? I heard things like respect. Well, what does that look like behaviorally? I'm being respectful. Well, what does that mean behaviorally, right? And if you're inside the institution or a policy place that gets money, the distance from you and community is the same. Why is community always having to go to you? And if I went to community, what would they have to say about you? Because it's not always about what your professional colleagues have to say how great and wonderful you are, based on the publications and the research dollars you get. Because community, I put a lot more stock into what community has to say than what your colleagues have to say, because that's more real, right? So what else? Yeah, so those are some things that you can start. It's probably a lot. Take a little bit, move through it, and looking for accomplices.
Yeah, it's fantastic because you're talking about relationship, right? And I think when we're talking about community-based research, I think, Charlie, you were talking about relationship as well to your community. And that all coming together as reducing harm, right? Trauma-informed systems, decolonizing systems. So we are running out of time, but I really want to thank both of you. This was a fantastic discussion, and you shared so much amazing insight and perspective. So I really appreciate the time. I want to thank all the folks who attended, listened, and posed questions. We will be sending out a link to the recording in the next week, so look for that in your email. And then if you did enjoy today, we are doing a special homecoming edition of Inspiring Conversations, Retirement, How to Prepare Your Mind and Your Finances, on September 20th. Yeah, so I think we're here to wrap up. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Percy. Thank you, Charlie. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.